Well, it falls to me then to introduce Billy Mag Fhloinn, whom I will be speaking to, and I am grateful to Genevieve for finishing on that particular note, because I think what we are talking about here is the centrality of culture in this world. And am I right in saying, Billy, that it's an analogue world, really?
Well, we will try and keep a mix of past and future. That's, I think, where the real dynamic things happen. So.
Also very grateful to John Naughton for introducing Huxley into the conversation, because as I was listening to that panel, I was wondering how, in the name of God, am I going to make pagans actually make any sense in that context? And Huxley provided the answer, because Huxley's other book, written at the end of his life, was The Doors of Perception. And he took that title from a poem by William Blake, who was, like Huxley himself, an intellectual, an artist, a mystic, and a poet. And he said, there are things known and things unknown, and in between there are the doors of perception. And that's where we come in, I think, Billy.
I think so, yeah.
That's where you come in, anyway. And that's where. So today, Billy and I are going to be talking, and tomorrow you and us are going to be doing. And that's basically how we've broken it down. And so before you can actually do what you have to do tomorrow, we're going to talk about what that would be. And the pagan thing is a bit of, it's a kind of a catch-all. I mean, it's not meant to be a very accurate description, so don't worry. It's not, those of you who are, paid up Buddhists and Presbyterians and so on needn't fear. So why pagan, Billy? Why did you pick that particular tag?
It's evocative. It's a bit like J.R.R. Tolkien, when he was talking about the word Celtic. He said it's like a magic bag into which anything can be put and anything can be taken out of. So I used it because it's a topic that a lot of people are interested in, and particularly in this really technical digital age, that there is this sense, as people sort of lose touch with the tangible world and get more into the digital world, there is also a desire, while people still maintain or keep their phones and their computers in that digital world that they live in, there is this growing need that people have for something tangible as well. And very often what I see is that people will look to the past, will look to our own cultural heritage in Ireland, which we're very lucky to have, as something that we cherish culturally, and this sense of the ancient past. We live with it in the landscape, and we're constantly reminded of it. There are mnemonic devices all over Ireland, castles and ruins and tombs and things like that, which evoke the past all the time. So I was looking at this idea of a way of combining art, archaeology, history, folklore, these various different topics that I'm interested in. And another, I suppose, element to it is the rituals and ceremonies that historically formed part of our culture. And pagan, I suppose, in a term, it's not very accurate. It can mean what you want it to mean. But people have this sense of, this connection with the past, this depth that it can bring some meaning forth to them. And I think environmentalism is an important part of that as well. There is a perceived idea of what paganism was, and it had this deep connection to the land and to landscape. And as we become more environmentally aware, in previous generations, I was speaking to a man from South Kerry before, Daniel O'Connell, incidentally, and he, not the same one, but I'm not that kind of pagan that can talk to the dead. He was saying growing up there was no word, they had no word for the environment, that there was no concept of it, but they just lived in it. So we now have this growing sense of sort of seeing the system that we live in, and I'm drawing on that in an imaginative way, and using sort of inspiration from that world. There's a sense as well in the air of what the past might have been, whether it's true or not. And I study in I have a sort of academic approach to looking at the past through archaeology and through history and anthropology and folklore. Folklore is my main way of looking at it. But there is a sense of what the past was, this ancient past, and whether it's real or not. This sort of popular idea that people have of what the past was and what ceremony and celebration was at the past. So I'm drawing on that popular idea of what it is and sort of presenting through these ceremonies, through the wearing of masks and the playing of these instruments and getting together around a fire to sort of create a timeless, if you want to call it that, atemporal, I suppose, sense that, okay, maybe what we're doing is not authentic, but it seems it has the feel of it, and therefore it becomes an authentic experience within its own parameters. People find great significance to it, and I'm not dogmatic at all in it. I'm certainly not a pagan as such myself, and we don't profess any dogma. So when these things happen, it's up to people to draw their own meaning from them. And I don't tell people out there. They can be complicated and they give a lot of fine detail to them, but I don't tell anybody what these ceremonies are meant to be, and it's up to each individual to get out of it what they find in it.
I think that raises two questions for me. The first one is the notion that tradition is somehow locked down at some unspecified time in the past, and that it's fenced off with "keep out" written on it, unless you have a card, a passport into some of the access routes into it. But that actually is a completely wrong-headed notion of tradition.
Any tradition that creates parameters around itself and doesn't evolve as a response to people's needs gets very quickly forgotten. I did a doctoral thesis. My doctoral thesis was on the Feast of St. Martin, which was traditional ritual animal sacrifice in Ireland. And that tradition survived until very, very late. I spoke to a woman in County Clare who did it in 2003. And this was something that was very vital throughout the 20th century. But as soon as chickens became available in shops, that was essentially what put an end to this tradition, which I think spread back into a very ancient past. So as soon as something loses relevance, it dies off very, very quickly. And you have the older generation who did it, their children who remember it done, and their children, the grandchildren, who've never even heard of it. So things can die that quick. So ceremonial and ritual and culture and all of the various different things that we're dabbling in here has to be dynamic, has to be meaningful, and as soon as it's not, it's gone. So I suppose I'm taking older motifs and ideas as inspiration, but I'm really injecting them with a relevance nowadays, and people are crying out for that sense of ceremony, that sense of ritual.
So given that technology actually did away with the foundation of the belief, I'm thinking of somebody who said, electric light did away with house hauntings and fairies.
Yeah.
So, that world has gradually been stripped out of meaning. So what now has the meaning that can be reimagined in these new ceremonies that you're creating?
Well, sometimes just the notion that you're participating in something old is enough to give a sense of meaning. And very often when you ask people in traditional customs, why do they do it? And the original reason or the original motivation, which may have been religious in origin or may have had some kind of social function, often the reason that they give is because it's tradition, because that's just what we do. And it becomes part of your identity and local expression and artistic and cultural expression. And sometimes just the thing for its own sake is enough. So if I'm drawing on these motifs and ideas, these costumes, this music, it gives people a sense of connection. And, the costumes that I make, I've made quite a lot. I've made about 70 costumes, I suppose. I make them out of animal bones and straw and leather and all of these various different materials. And there's a sort of a visceral materiality to them, which people find really, they connect very well with them. And I'm drawing on archetypes as well. I'm using animal imagery, making animal type masks and things like that. So ultimately, the meaning of what it is up to the individual. But when you bring people into a ritual space, and that's essentially what it is, we're talking about place, and we're talking about being on the edge. And, anthropological theory talks about liminality, and this is a really important concept, is liminality, this threshold where you're moving from one space to another. Are you moving from one time to another? Are you moving from one state in terms of your status in society to another? So you separate from normal space. Transformation happens, and it's in this ceremonial context, and then you reintegrate into regular space. So it kind of happened, there was a lot of trial runs and various different things that ended up becoming Pagan Rave in the end, but one of them was a 40th birthday for a friend of mine up in his garden in Leitrim, where his invited guests were sort of doing normal party, bit of music, bit of dancing, that kind of thing. And next minute, about 15 creatures emerged from the night with flaming torches. And we didn't tell anybody what was happening. We just beckoned them, and we brought them up through a garden path to this huge space that we had cleared. And then we had built, 15-foot wooden effigy that we set on fire. And nobody was expecting it, and nobody knew what it was supposed to be. But immediately, everybody threw themselves at it. And there was one guy, and it was this conversation that I had with him sort of really inspired me to push the project forward. He was an insurance salesman from 3 doors up, who just happened to be there because he lived 3 doors up. And he was there in his sort of loosened tie and enjoying himself. And he was looking around, and he says, I don't know what that was, but he said, I feel like I've been pulled out of reality and into something else. And for that moment, all you could see was sort of this flaming colossus of wood, and a sort of a perimeter of 100 feet, and then there was darkness outside. So he just had this illuminated circle, and within that, there was flaming torches and animal skulls and, a wild boar crest, and I was playing a big bronze trumpet up in the air and stuff like that. And it was probably, if you're not expecting it, an extraordinarily strange situation to find yourself in.
So that thing that you mentioned, that draw, that need or attraction to being pulled out of normal time. Mm-hmm. I think people actually don't quite, maybe they underestimate the degree to which it happens in regular life without the boars' heads appearing out of bushes or 15-foot high bonfires or whatever. Yeah. So there are kind of rites of passage where people, with the best will in the world, sometimes it goes horribly wrong. But I'm thinking here of things like hen parties, stags, football matches, where normal time is suspended and mad stuff happens.
Yeah.
So, but these kind of ceremonies, the kind that you create and the ones that they connect to, were both structured, and they happened often on certain days, at certain times of the year. If you take Venice Carnival or something like that, with certain kinds of costumes, motifs, and so on. So they look on the one. I mean, they are both unstructured and improvised.
Yeah.
Is that true? Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a kind of a sense, if you come at these events as an outsider, they look spontaneous, and there's lots of spontaneity happening within them. But when you're in a culture and there are cultural rules that you never formally learn, but they're sort of in the air, and you pick them up, so you know how you're supposed to behave at a stag party, for example, or misbehave indeed. But I'm even thinking of the Wren's Day here in Dingle. It's a very elaborate festival where people wear masks and the different wrens parade around, and they get together at a certain time of day and play music at the bottom of the street. If you knew nothing about it, you'd approach it and say, this is insanity. But there is a structure to it. And, preparing the structure and telling everybody how it's going to happen beforehand, right? First we're going to do this, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do this. It seems like it's breaking the spontaneity, but it doesn't. And then on an individual level, there's all kinds of opportunity for individual expression within it. So when I'm sort of planning something like a performance or like a ritual, like we did at Fhloinn and Bealtaine here, we had about 70 of us in costumes and masks, and we knew how it was all going to play out up to a certain point. It's like I make a big elaborate clockwork and wind it up, and it runs to a certain point, and then I've no idea what's going to happen after that. And spontaneous things, all kinds of amazing spontaneous things happen after that. We had the Lords of Strath showed up, their performers, and one of them was lying on his back with his feet up in the air, and the other was standing on top of his feet like that. All of a sudden, that just happened. Or at the second one that we ran, people who weren't wearing masks were sort of digging their hands into the mud and painting stripes on their face because they just wanted to be a part of it. And just little things like that where people feel, they want to get involved and want to engage with this, and just spontaneous dancing and music and all that kind of stuff breaks out as part of it, because you create an atmosphere where it's very clear that this is not normal behavior, this is not normal time, and the rules are suspended, as they are, in the proverbial stag party, where you're given social license to misbehave because it's in the parameters of this thing. People would act in a way that they normally wouldn't at all. And even bar owners, up to a point, will have a certain tolerance for bad behavior because they know they're just a stag. Now, eventually, the straw will break and they'll be chucked out. But, you see it in anthropological study of human behavior all the time.
And all over the world and at all times.
Yeah.
And there seem to be elements to it that seem to cross culture and cross time.
Sure.
I think like fire and masks would be one. And also some form of stimulant of some kind.
Yeah, and now we will be doing a mini pagan rave here tomorrow, and you will be the ravers. I'm not bringing any poaching this time, but I have been known to bring some in the past. There's a book which I had sort of, the project was well up and running before I came across this book, which was Dancing in the Streets by Barbara Ehrenreich. And she was talking about collective joy as a concept, and how, cultures, certainly perhaps more in the past than modern industrial capitalist Western culture, had this sense of collective joy. And she looks at expressions of collective joy throughout history and throughout different cultures, mainly focusing on Western Europe, I have to say. But she said the things that you have, that sort of magic ingredients that will always ensure it, is if you have music, if you have stimulants, and if you have masks. And I think the mask, it's a really important thing where this concept of collective joy, we don't even have a term for it. And she laments the fact that our language doesn't have a term for this notion of collective joy. It doesn't always have to be stimulant, alcohol fueled, but it certainly helps. But this notion that the individual can lose themselves, and the mask is a very quick way of ridding the ego. And you surrender to the group behavior, and you surrender to the moment and to the event. And it has this incredibly liberating feeling for people. And there's really strong social connections. Ironically, when you cover somebody's face, they become themselves more than ever. And when you have patterns of behavior, dances, big circle dances, those kinds of things, where there is a certain kind of structure, but everybody's clearly participating in it, that it has this really strong group cohesion effect, and it tends to bind communities very well together, and individuals flourish in these kinds of communities. So.
By coincidence, I had been given that book for Christmas, last Christmas, and told to read it. It was kind of an order, and I didn't know that you had got the book as well. And so we ended up talking about this event, having both read that book. And one of the things that she says, which I remember, is that over time in the West, and particularly in Europe, which was the scene of so many rich, vivid festivals, seasonal festivals, rites of passage, and so on, which were, as you say, collective, that they were gradually shut down, and that it seemed to have really got into gear after the Reformation, and putting, strangely, seats and pews into churches. Because before that, you could bring your dog and your child and walk around and so on, dance if you wanted to, and that you see over the Industrial Revolution, the working day, life becoming more and more regulated, and then you see the rising sort of commodification of culture. And with that you get, and this is quite pernicious, I think, in terms of cultural history, you get the distinction between the performer and the viewer spectator. So now you have people who used to participate in cultural events moved to the side as spectators, and preferably paying spectators. And now you have people who might even, go to see something, but would watch it watch it on a screen and download it if they could. So you are creating a space for these kind of ceremonies, which you've identified as being something that's been there forever, that people relate to without knowing anything about them, without having any lived experience of them, and yet innately being attracted to them, that they're collective, that they're participatory. And unfortunately, it's impossible to make any money out of them.
Yeah, well, I'm not in it for the money. It's quite unfortunate when you look back to how this kind of expression used to happen versus how very often it happens now, like you said, under this sort of very controlled and structured environment. But when I do these things, it is very much about, like, we set up the initial part of the ceremonies often. If we're doing a big one where we'll have the audience, they'll be roped off. And there is a certain particular point where we very clearly cut the ropes and people kind of stand there going, what happens now? And when you show them this is happening separate and then deliberately create that moment where you're dissolving the gap between performer and spectator, obviously we're giving them the cue, in you come, and now you are this as well. And in fact, I'll be looking for that exact participation from you all tomorrow. I have about 50 masks here, so the first 50 lucky wearers will get to wear them. But and
they are things of beauty, it must be said. Everyone made by Billy, a man who spends €500 a year on glue and not for reasons you might think.
Yeah. not that kind of stimulant. Yeah.
And just because we'll go into talking about this beast of a thing. Instruments, you also make instruments. Why do you make instruments? Why do you not just play a tape?
Well, it's a good question. Mainly so we can bring them to parties and just let people go at it. But the instruments are specifically designed to be playable with each other with minimal skill. So tomorrow it will happen, I have about 10 instruments, it will happen that I will give people instruments that they've never even seen before, not to mention play. But they're all in key with each other. So even if you just hit it or bang it or do whatever it does, a sound will come out that is in key with everybody else. So if you play an instrument, or if you have ever played an instrument, I will be drawing on your enthusiasm tomorrow, which I'll be expecting in waves. But the instruments, the whole thing is participatory on purpose. And this notion of the music can be familiar, but it also has to be a little bit strange, and the instruments are a little bit strange. Some of them are based on historical instruments from our own culture, others from European culture, others I've just made up myself. But it's about participating in unison, and it's about creating something which has the feeling of authenticity, whether it is or not. And it ends up being very authentic to our own culture and our own cultural expression. And people, it's in fitting with the ethos of the whole project, is that it's participatory, it's disconnected but familiar at the same time, and it fits very well with the aesthetic of the whole thing, I think. And that musical expression is really important. It's one of the pillars of the project, is having that kind of music. So,
without any more ado, I will ask you to just introduce this instrument and let's see what it can do. And also, maybe you should tell us what it's not.
Okay, yeah, that's probably very important. There's nothing digital at all about this instrument. This is very, very low tech. You won't believe me when you hear it that it's not, but I have no effects or no reverb or anything on it. It's bone dry in terms of sound, but this is what it really sounds like. I'm just going to tune it. Hopefully it's in tune. This is the most high-tech thing, is the tuner, which is on my phone. But I'll just let you hear what it sounds like first. I'll tell you what it is. It's called a Yebahar. There are only a few of them in the world. The concept was come up with by a guy called Görkem Şem. He's a Turkish guy who did a master's in music technology. And at the end of it, I think he was disillusioned with how technical music technology was. So he wanted a sound which sounded like electronic music but was entirely acoustic. So he came up with this, and I wrote him and I asked him would he mind if I built one, and he said to go ahead. So This is the sound.
you.